In the winter of 1905, a drilling crew working the lower levels of a silver mine in the Nevada desert broke through a wall of ancient rock and found something that had no business being there. Not ore, not a natural cavern, something else. By the next morning, before any photographs could be taken, before any outside engineers could be called in, a cement crew had been dispatched. The passage was sealed. The foreman filed no formal report, and the men who were down there that night were quietly reassigned to other camps before the week was out. This is not a rumour. It is not a legend passed down through campfire retellings. It is a thread pulled from the documented history of the Tonopah mining district, and the further you pull it, the more the official story starts to unravel. Tonopah sits in the middle of the Nevada high desert, roughly halfway between Reno and Las Vegas, at an elevation that makes the wind feel personal. It is a small town today, quiet in the way that places get quiet after everything that made them matter has already happened. But in the early 1900s, Tonopah was the center of one of the most significant silver strikes in American history. The man who started it, a prospector named Jim Butler, stumbled onto silver ore in 1900 almost by accident, and within 3 years the population of the surrounding area had exploded. Mines went into the ground at a frenzied pace. Shafts were sunk, drifts were driven horizontally into hillsides, and the rock that came out of those tunnels was making men rich faster than they knew what to do with the money. By 1905, the Tonopah Mining Company and several competing operations had driven tunnels hundreds of feet into the earth. The geology of the area was well understood by that point, or so the engineers believed. Volcanic tuff, layers of rhyolite, deposits of silver chloride and argentite running in veins through the host rock. They knew what to expect. They had maps, they had survey data, they had years of drilling logs that told them more or less exactly what was down there. What the logs did not account for was a section of tunnel in one of the deeper drifts where the rock abruptly changed character. Miners working that level in late November of 1905 began reporting anomalies. The walls in a particular stretch of tunnel were smoother than surrounding rock, not polished by water or worn by natural erosion, but flat in a way that made the men uneasy. One miner, in a letter later found among family papers and referenced by a regional historian in the 1970s, described it as walking through a section where the rock felt cut. His word, cut. He wrote it twice in the same paragraph, which tells you something about how much it stayed with him. The crew bosses dismissed this. Miners were a superstitious group, and the deep tunnels had a way of playing with perception. Low oxygen, strange acoustics, the constant pressure of knowing how much rock was above your head. Men imagine things. This was documented often enough in the mining literature of the era that supervisors had standing orders not to indulge reports of unusual feelings in the lower drifts. Strange sensations underground were a management problem long before they were ever treated as an engineering one. But then the drill broke through, not into ore, not into a pocket of trapped gas or an underground spring, into something that had no geological explanation. The exact date is difficult to pin down because the incident was never formally logged, which is itself a significant detail. In a period when mining companies kept obsessive records of every foot drilled and every pound of ore extracted, the absence of a log entry is not an oversight. It is a decision. What is known comes from secondary sources, from the letter mentioned above, from a brief and cryptic reference in a Tonopah newspaper from December 1905 that mentions a work stoppage at one of the deeper operations without giving a reason, and from an account recorded decades later by a man who claimed his grandfather had been on the crew. According to these sources, the drill punched through a section of the tunnel wall into open space, not a natural void. The opening revealed a passage of some kind running at an angle that did not correspond to any known geological feature of the area. The walls of this passage were described as uniform, not rough-hewn, not the product of hand tools or the drilling equipment of the era. Uniform in the way that stops men cold when they encounter it 600 feet underground, because nothing about the earth at that depth is supposed to be uniform. The floor showed no sediment accumulation consistent with a space that had been open for any geological length of time. And the air that came through the opening, according to the miner's letter, was not the dead, stale air you would expect from a sealed pocket. It moved. He described feeling it against his face before he understood where it was coming from. We should be careful here about what we are claiming and what we are not. The alternative history community has a habit of running so far ahead of the evidence that the evidence disappears entirely. What these sources describe is not a city. It is not a chamber filled with artifacts or machines or anything that dramatic. It is a passage of uncertain origin in a mine that was immediately closed off. The significance is not in what was found. The significance is in what was done about it and how fast. Within hours of the breakthrough, the crew was pulled from that level, not rotated out, not sent to a different section of the mine where other ore bodies needed attention, pulled entirely. Men who had been working that drift for weeks were told they were done and were given their pay on the spot. A cement crew was brought in the following day. This is documented in payroll records that survive in the Nevada State Archives, where a line item for cement and labor appears on the Tonopah Mining Company books for December 1905 without any corresponding project notation. That is not unusual in itself. Mining operations spent money on maintenance and sealing all the time, but combined with the work stoppage, the crew reassignment, and the absence of drilling logs for that period, it builds a picture that is harder to dismiss as routine. The drift was sealed. And it stayed sealed. Now here is where the Tartaria framework becomes relevant, because the question people stop at, which is what exactly was in that passage, is actually the less interesting question. The more interesting question is why the response was so immediate and so total. Mining operations in 1905 did not shut down drifts overnight because of strange rock. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Strange rock was the business. Anomalous geology was noted, evaluated, and either exploited or abandoned based on its economic value. The protocol did not include calling in a cement crew before dawn and reassigning the entire crew without documentation. That protocol did not exist unless someone had written it in advance for exactly this kind of situation. The speed of the response implies prior knowledge of what to do if something like this was encountered. That is a different kind of claim than saying they found something strange. It is saying that whoever made the call knew exactly what category of strange this was and had already decided how to handle it. The broader Tartaria thesis, for those who are newer to this research, holds that the historical record we have been given contains significant gaps and deliberate omissions related to a pre-existing global civilization that was far more technically advanced than the timeline we are taught. The evidence for this comes from hundreds of locations worldwide, from anomalous construction techniques in buildings that predate the technologies supposedly required to build them, from unexplained voids beneath ancient cities, from architectural uniformity across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, and from a recurring pattern of well-resourced institutions moving quickly to contain and conceal when something inconsistent with the accepted narrative is uncovered. That last point is the thread that connects Tonopah to the larger picture. Nevada is not the first place your mind goes when you think about anomalous underground structures. You think Egypt. You think the tunnels beneath Derinkuyu, the underground city in Turkey that housed tens of thousands of people and whose full extent is still not mapped. You think of the Bosnian pyramid complex or the underwater structures off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan. But Nevada has its own documented history of strange subsurface findings, and the Tonopah incident does not stand alone even within that regional context. In 1931, during the construction of a road near Lovelock, Nevada, roughly 200 miles northwest of Tonopah, workers uncovered a cave system that contained artifacts inconsistent with any known indigenous culture of the region. including mummified remains of individuals with red hair who measured significantly taller than surrounding populations. The Lovelock Cave findings were documented, partially studied, and then largely removed from public discussion. The physical evidence was scattered across multiple institutions and private collections in a way that made comprehensive analysis difficult. The pattern is not identical to Tonopah, but the shape of the response rhymes in ways that are worth sitting with. Further south, in the Mojave Desert region, there are accounts from the early 20th century of mining operations that encountered worked stone at depths that should have been geologically undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years. The Calavera skull, found in California in 1866, in a mine shaft under a layer of volcanic ash that geologists dated to the Pliocene epoch, was subjected to decades of dismissal before the debate simply went quiet. Quiet is not resolved. In the context of anomalous underground findings across the American West, quiet is a pattern, not a conclusion. What ties these incidents together is not necessarily a single civilization or a single explanation. It is the consistency of the institutional response. Document minimally, conceal quickly, move on. The archaeological and geological establishment has deep institutional incentives to maintain a coherent timeline, because that timeline underpins everything from academic careers to museum funding to the cultural narratives that governments use to establish legitimacy. A passage of non-geological origin found 600 feet underground in a Nevada silver mine in 1905 does not fit that timeline. It does not fit at all, and so it was cemented over before anyone with independent expertise could look at it. The men who were reassigned from that drift did not vanish. They worked other mines. Some of them talked in the careful way that men talk when they are not sure who is listening. The miner whose letter survives wrote to a cousin, and that letter stayed in a family collection for 60 years before anyone recognized what it described. The grandson who gave the recorded account did so in the 1960s, by which point the Tonopah mining district had been largely dormant for decades, and nobody with institutional power had any particular reason to care about an old man's memory of his grandfather's story. But here is what that recorded account adds that the letter does not. He said his grandfather described the surface of the walls in that passage as having a colour that did not match anything in the surrounding geology. Not mineral staining, not bioluminescence, which does occur in some deep rock environments. A colour that he said looked applied. His grandfather had spent 30 years underground. He knew what applied meant, and he knew what it did not mean, and he was specific about which one this was. We cannot verify that account. We are being direct about that. A second-hand recollection recorded 60 years after the fact, describing something a man experienced 60 years before that, is not primary evidence, but it is also not nothing. It is consistent with the letter. It is consistent with the documented anomalies in the company records, and it describes something that, if accurate, rules out every natural explanation for what was in that passage. The cement that sealed that drift has been in place for over 120 years. The Tonopah mining district is not an active operation. The specific shaft location has never been publicly identified with enough precision for independent investigation. The Nevada State Archives hold the payroll records, but not the drilling logs, because the drilling logs for that period are listed as missing, which is the kind of detail that looks unremarkable until you are looking for it and then looks like nothing else. There is a version of this story where a crew of tired miners broke through into a natural void. The company sealed it for liability reasons, and the rest is embellishment layered on over decades. That version is possible, but it does not explain the speed of the response. It does not explain the complete absence of any documentation from the crew in question. It does not explain why men who had been working a productive drift were reassigned rather than simply moved to a different section of the same mine. And it does not explain why the entry in the company books lists cement and labour with no project notation in an industry where every expenditure was tied to a specific operational purpose. The official record stops at the edge of that sealed drift, and it was designed to stop there. The unofficial record, fragmentary and imperfect as it is, describes something on the other side of that cement wall that the men who put it there did not want examined. What that something was, we may never know with certainty. But the fact that we are not supposed to ask is reason enough to keep asking. The tunnels beneath our history are deeper than we are told. And somewhere in the Nevada desert, behind a century of concrete, there is a passage that points in a direction we have not been permitted to follow. Not yet. But the record exists, and it is fragmentary precisely because someone wanted it that way. Records, unlike cement, have a way of developing cracks over time, and those cracks are where the light gets in.